You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskins, your host. As always, this week we've got one of my really close mates in the industry who we actually go back many, many years and different companies together, starting off with small-scale projects. And look at him now. It's Dan Paton, Managing Director of Developed in Subiaco. How you going, mate?
Good, Trent. Thanks for having me. It has been a little bit of a journey, and I think we can both look back probably 5 to 10 years from where we were, and it's definitely a little bit of a different picture now.
Yeah, I remember the first project that you were helping me on. We were looking after a couple of clients in Craigie on 2 triplexes next to each other where their driveways were shared with reciprocal rights easements, which starts to get pretty nerdy when we're talking about that. And they were 980 square metre original blocks, and those blocks we paid $470,000 for originally each.
Wow.
We'd be at probably about $900,000 to $1 million, I'd say.
I was going to say property now in hindsight.
Yeah.
If you could have bought 10 of those, you would have.
Exactly right. And that is the point, especially with small-scale subdivision, which we're not going to talk about too much today, but it's certainly a part of the journey for a lot of first-time developers and those that move forward, is that they're not making any more of it. Once you've done a few of them, the street starts to run out of opportunities eventually, and that's what we're starting to see in many suburbs in Perth right now, is especially those that have been developable, rezoned a few decades ago. There are some streets that are nearly totally developed out.
You drive down some streets, for example, in Scarborough Doubleview, and you just about can't drive down the street. It's a one-way road, just given that vehicle street we live in.
Before we get too deep into all of our anecdotes that we're going to share today, wanted to talk about your past, because you're probably the most contemporary example, the youngest example that I know in my circles, and I'd like to think most circles in Perth, of a fella who's come through the ranks in the surveying, planning space, got his first job, started a business, really kicking some goals. And for a lot of those people who would be in their early 20s or even in their 30s looking to make some sort of step into the property industry, you're a really good example of someone who's done their hard yards and now starting to make waves. Please tell us a little bit about your story from I guess high school onwards to where you are today.
Going through primary school through to high school, I've probably always been someone that just enjoys the outdoors. I'm a social guy, and I'm probably not the definition of academic, but I appreciate that you need pieces of paper in the world we live in. Going into year 12, I didn't really know what I was going to do. It was a choice between being a personal trainer or maybe doing surveying, which was this thing my auntie at the time suggested.
No one in year 12, I think, even knows what surveying is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I didn't at the time. I had essentially my second cousin that was a surveyor, and I phoned him one night, asked him what it was like. He said it was okay. So that basically made my decision to go, okay, let's see where this goes.
I remember when I was a lot younger, not having any context of the property industry or just the surveying space. And the only way that I could recognise a surveyor was that guy that I thought was holding a molten over gun on the street. It's going, oh, and then, oh no, just this guy measuring something with a reflective bulb at the end and really not knowing why. That was my extent early days of surveying in high school. And it's funny how as you get older, you start to recognise just how important surveyors are to the built form space everywhere in our world.
I think surveying is one of those things that I never realised would be such a strong foundation that underpins, I guess, the future to where I went or am going. Surveying's everywhere. It's from where buildings are meant to be located through to assets, through to the curve of the earth. It's
mining.
It is genuinely everywhere. I'm trying now, I guess, to try push the word spatial instead of surveying, because I think that's actually where it's going and what it reflects, and that's probably more a 21st century view of it, because surveying is one of the oldest professions in the world.
That's right. Where did you do your study? Where do you do study for surveying, and what was it like?
I studied at Curtin University. That's the only place in Western Australia, along with TAFE. So you can go to TAFE and study surveying, or you can go to Curtin University. So I chose Curtin. It's a 4-year degree, and I really enjoyed it. I met a lot of great people there that I'm actually still friends with today. So socially, there's a lot of good people that actually do surveying. They're pretty straight shooters.
Is it a big cohort? Do many people end up doing surveying and sticking it out to the end?
Yeah, it's nearly like being stranded on an island. So you might start off with 30 or 40 intakes, and I think by the time we graduated, there was 5 of us.
Wow,
so they
that's
do
architect level.
Yeah, and it's very much determined by the mining booms and busts. But coming out, I think there's basically 100% employment rate. So it's a very employable profession.
Because it's not just property, right? As we've sort of mentioned, you've got civil, you've got mining, oil and gas. There's a lot of entities, a lot of industries that need this service.
That's probably one of the hardest things with surveying is you can keep changing. So you can nearly have 4 or 5 mini careers in one career just by changing sectors. I think that's why you'll find a lot of surveyors, they actually do fall in love with the job because they can keep changing and it keeps evolving.
You come out of university, what's the first job?
I went into engineering surveying. So I worked with RM Surveys. They do all the big construction stuff around town.
See their cars rolling around quite often?
They were fantastic. That was probably my first experience to what a true sort of founding director is like. I still remember the first bit of advice I got, which was walk quickly.
Mine was don't wear that tie again.
Yeah, and tuck your shirt in, which I let that one go. But no, that was really good. That really gave me a taste of property development, how the nuts and bolts of stuff actually getting built, how sewers work, how engineers work. We dealt with everyone from the concreters on site at 5 a.m. through to the engineers and the property developers as well.
You made a transition into that subdivision space at Vision Surveys somewhere into your 20s. Did that come with a requirement for a planning background?
No, it didn't. So at that point in time, I was looking to pivot into more the land development realm, and Jay at Vision kindly offered me a job. At first I declined, and then I had to kindly go back and ask for it later, which he kindly gave me a job. And that really opened my eyes up to the world of consulting and the fact that that little bit of planning where just because something says something doesn't mean that's the black and white rule. And I really fell in love, I guess, with that area of grey, which is what consulting and planning really is.
That's why there is a planning industry, because if there wasn't any grey, it'd be fairly linear and consultants probably wouldn't be justifying any fees because it's either a yes or a no most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. So then the natural progression from there was I started to see that Perth is really an infill market, and we're probably transitioning to that next stage.
Well, it should be an infill market.
We're getting there, slow and steady, one house at a time.
Yeah.
But I really saw that need that there's a built form solution to a lot of projects, and that naturally led me into that town planning curiosity, which saw me then take on my master's back at Curtin University as a mature age student.
What does that look like when you're doing your master's in town planning? What do you come out of it with?
In terms of the actual knowledge and foundation of land tenure, not a lot, but what it gave me was an appreciation of design and consideration for the built environment, but more so a network. Because at the end of the day, planning is really a bunch of people coming together and deciding that something is either a good idea or a poor idea.
Isn't that right? It is so subjective when you think about what is built in Perth versus what's built in Mumbai, Singapore, London. What's considered poor planning or poor design here is marvelled at in other parts of the world and vice versa.
Correct. And I do have a lot of sympathy for town planners and especially planning schemes, because a lot of the time they're put in place and they're trying to project forward 10 or 15 years on what densities should look like or what something should look and feel like. And that's quite a difficult job. I don't think many people can predict the future that well, and that's kind of what the planners are trying to do when they put these schemes in place.
And a lot of it looks good or bad in hindsight. We think about big structural planning decisions that were made in Western Australia in the 50s and 60s. Those decisions were probably consensus at the time and everyone thought this is a great idea, and we look back at it and a lot of people struggle with some of those planning ideas these days and think, how could you make that decision in terms of the sprawl we've got and the directions we're going? Look at where Vancouver is. We could have gone in their direction. What seems logical and practical and a really smart idea now doesn't always stay the same over decades, doesn't stand the test of time.
Yeah, correct. And communities come and go and change over time. Density is a big topic in Western Australia, but density has to go somewhere, and it's really just part of that next generation or next stage of Perth and evolving forward to be a more mature city.
It also gave you a piece of paper, which probably helps justify starting your own business in that planning space.
It does, yeah. So the Masters, it was quite an enjoyable degree. Probably enjoyed that more than the surveying, but that might have been in hindsight that I enjoy the grey more than black and white of surveying. Alongside that, I also went through and did my certified practicing project management accreditation through Australian Institute of Project Management, and I've also got my triennial certificate for real estate. I enjoy the full life cycle of property development, more so than just any particular part, and that really motivated me then to start my own business.
So Developed is fairly unique in that there are surveying companies out there, there are town planning businesses out there, but not many that do it together, and not many that tie it together in a project management space, and especially in that urban infill environment where I think you've made most of the brand at the moment. Not exclusively, but certainly where you probably have a lot of phone calls coming through. Those are really the three pivotal services, and especially small scale and infill subdivision is surveying, project management, and town planning. So I guess that was the foundation of the first services you were offering to the world.
Yeah, that's the three pillars, and it used to confuse people at the start because it was just me, and I'd put the different hat on depending on who they wanted. But no, it's been pivotal. It was really the surveying, the grassroots of where I've always sort of been, and those small infill subdivisions are just enjoyable and I find them rewarding. But the planning is really where you can add value to clients the most, I find. And the delivery is really something that just ties the bow on the overall service.
Otherwise, you're relying on someone else to execute an outcome that you've created.
Correct. And especially in the infill space, there's generally not the fees to have a project manager engaged full time. So sometimes it needs like a soft approach just to help nudge the project along.
Now the business progresses from there, and there's a focus on larger projects, and I'm sure the client base starts to grow and ask you to do different things, just like every growing business. Where is it at these days? What are the most recent projects that people would have probably recognised on LinkedIn getting approved? What have you been involved in recently, and how does it speak to where the industry is right now?
Recently, or this week actually, we had a really great approval down in Fremantle for 247 hotel beds on Essex Street. That initially got deferred, recommended for a refusal twice, and we've ultimately got it approved. Look, we had a great project team, first and foremost. It's never one person, it's everyone. We had Kylie from Roth Lomans there. Fantastic, that helps, and a great consultant team behind that. But it's really the strategy. You need to be very clear from the outset what is non-negotiable and what is negotiable, and then work your way through the system.
Well, let's think about it. It's a hotel in Fremantle that's going to change the face of a street. It's going to add amenity. It's obviously going to be done properly. It's not a half novice two-lot subdivision. So we can't really complain about that as a community. So it's really more the question of, do we want a hotel here or do we not want a hotel here? That's where it boils down to, right? And it comes down to the same thing with apartments and industrial and childcare. We can look at all of the nitpicking and, do I want to change this, or can we revise this, and can we go back to design with this? But at the end of the day, most of that is absolutely biased by the one question, do I want the hotel here or not?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think land uses really need a lot more magnification on, if you zoom out and look at Fremantle and go, does it need more accommodation for tourist style people there that are going to travel to Rottnest and all these surrounding places? Does that fit? Yes. Well, that should be a serious ticket that gets considered, because in 10, 20, 30 years' time, you'll look back in hindsight and go, well, that aged fantastically. Planning is always case by case. It's definitely not a vanilla, if you did it on one end of the street, you can do it on the other end of the street. It always needs to be in its own context and assessed in its own merit.
Where else are you working these days?
We've actually got a lot of regional work. So we're finding there's a lot of clients that are interested in projects around Exmouth, around Albany, Dunsborough. So we're really seeing maybe that destination, not quite residential development, but more maybe short stay or tourist focused. And then we've also had a lot of previous apartment approvals which haven't quite got out of the ground. They've got approved and it just doesn't seem to stack up, and we're having to do a lot of amendments to extend the approval timeframes on those. But I think that's probably the flavour of the month is apartments are still very difficult, and I think most of the property developers or project managers around Perth would say they're maybe the hardest project to get to work. We're still seeing childcares, we're still seeing hotel, hostel type projects. They're viable. It's just the pure residential plays are still very difficult.
That is actually the irony of it. Despite the fact that generally we are in the most undersupplied era of generations in Western Australia, where the market should be incentivising the industry to provide supply in the residential space. There should just be profit everywhere for anyone who wants to do a small scale subdivision, let alone apartment building. It's not the case. And so a lot of that energy and expertise is being pushed towards the regions, for example, or commercial, industrial development, where otherwise the expertise probably sat in doing apartments or other things, but they've got to look elsewhere just to put food on the table. And it is strange, but not surprising, given the stories we've heard on this podcast for years now, that it's not only that apartments are probably the most risky development type in the planning space, they've also now become risky in the finance space and risky in the execution delivery space, because there's hardly a builder around that could build it and not go broke. So it's not like we're solving one problem in the apartment space, is it? It's a number of problems. And when you add them all up, not only is there no profit to justify doing a development, there's no profit to justify doing development that hard to get off the ground in the first place.
No, exactly. And I'm really sympathetic to all the builders around town, not just that do the small scale infill housing, but also the apartments, because no one seems to really enjoy building them. I don't think there's actually anyone that wants to build apartments in Perth right now.
Well, think about all the reworks, things like waterproofing and all the issues that come up with apartments that we've seen in the news over the last couple of years. Who'd want to be that builder who's got the liability for years and years and years to fix stuff that comes up every single week? That erodes profit years after you finish the project.
That's it. And there's no quick solution to this scenario we're in, but maybe the longer term solution is, as Perth does mature as a city and evolve, we'll have a broader depth of builders, and that'll help. And then hopefully we're not in a situation where we have another housing shortage.
Well, what it's led to is this funneling of the only type of supply that's coming out of the ground right now. It's not apartments. It's for the most extent not small scale or mid scale urban infill either. It's really just land development. And so the only option that most of the buyer pool who are looking for a new residence are being given an option in is land development. And generally, it's on the fringes. That's where it's the least risky in a planning and delivery space. And of course, most developers, most experts in any space are going to go to the path of least resistance to be able to do their job. And that's sort of working counterproductively to where all of us expected we would want to be going as an industry over the last decade, isn't it?
Oh, exactly. And I mean, you've also got, I guess, the elephant in the room is the ongoing cost to just deliver land. Take the building component out, you still have school contributions, you still got public open space. There's a lot of cost just to get land to the market.
And that seems to be death by 1,000 cuts over 100 years in Western Australia. There was a time where we weren't paying public open space contribution. There was a time where we weren't paying Department of Education contributions, developer contributions to pay for the local streets and those sort of things that are coming up. Western Power Headworks, all those things all over time have been another condition added to a subdivision application, where it used to be paid for by the taxpayer. If we're going to open a new suburb up and we all agree that we should have it, then everyone, all 2-3 million of us, will pay a few dollars and contribute a few dollars towards that coming in. Now, the person who pays ultimately for the instigation of that new suburb is via the developer, the new home buyer, who's probably a first home buyer and paying tens and tens of thousands of dollars more for their land than they otherwise would have in a situation decades ago where the taxpayer paid for it.
Yeah, I mean,
who's to say that's fair?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it would be interesting to look at the buyers in these new land estates as a percentage of age and look at who's actually technically paying for all this infrastructure.
It's young people.
From the base of profile, it's the first home buyer.
And that sort of stacks on with where we are in the cost of living space right now. It's young people, it's people with mortgages, with student debt. All the cost of society, growing our state is really being shoved to young people. It's quite interesting, we think, about how that dynamic has edged away over the decades, and probably a digression from what we were talking about today. But you mentioned regional spaces as well. What's the feeling on the ground in the regions from developers? It's often a higher risk space to be in because the rug can get pulled from you pretty quickly in a place that's got such low supply and demand. Is there more confidence now than there's ever been in developing in Busselton, Albany, Bunbury, Dunsborough, Exmouth, these sort of parts of Western Australia?
I think there is some confidence there. It's definitely a different environment to Perth. What we've noticed, so just from a planning perspective, there is a lot more community feel. So you have to really give that due regard and make sure that they're heard and listened to. But further to that, you can also speak a little bit more directly with a lot of staff at these local shires and towns, which can be quite beneficial because you can get the result everyone wants a little bit quicker. In terms of Yeah, the risks, they're definitely there. The builders, they're a lot thinner. So I've got one client that's building up in Exmouth at the moment, and he's basically flown up his entire team from Perth. So they're not really using any local trades because there aren't any. They're all fully booked. And a classic example of the housing shortage up there is we needed to potentially present at the council meeting, and there was no accommodation up there to book. So it was nearly this comical thing of we can't get to the council meeting because there's nothing to book, but we're trying to get more housing approved.
Chicken and egg situation in the first place. Microsoft Teams would be very useful in that situation, Dan.
Exactly, and not all councils use that. So you still need to abide by their rules.
Let's segue on to the medium density code and how that has impacted our ability to add supply in the medium density space in the urban infill triplex to small scale apartment space in WA. I campaigned pretty rigorously, even with the Minister for Housing and Planning, sitting in the seat you're sitting in right now, just over a year ago, that the medium density code, whilst it has obviously some great outcomes in terms of allowing for a broader scope of infill, which I think we all want more options, it also used the opportunity to cut away from certain development types that some people in political spaces didn't want to be continuing in Western Australia, and that is really starting to cut out the triplex and force people to go to townhouses and things like that. I've seen on the ground, and we've had reports from agents on this podcast, like Adam Normovsky, who pretty much owns Balga through to Nollamara, that it's really dried up. Small scale infill is just not happening in those areas that it was otherwise every street you'd have a builder. And the big reason is because no one can get approved for single story builds anymore, and that townhouses just don't stack up in the medium to lower socio-demographic and socio-economic areas. You would see a broad spectrum of wealthy suburbs down to Balgas when it comes to infill applications. Where are you seeing the impact from a negative perspective? And then we'll talk about positive perspectives.
It's definitely gone away from a cookie cutter approach. So a classic example is if you've got a street running west-east and you've got blocks that are north-south running, it now matters which side of the street you're on. Essentially, the house design is going to have to reflect where the outdoor living goes. And
where the sun is.
Where the sun is. Like, that's the blunt reality now. Is that a good thing? I think it is, but it's definitely a shock to the system. And I think there's probably a lot of builders or developers and even investors that maybe had a cookie cutter approach, like a formula per se that worked.
That was efficient, cost effective.
That was efficient, yep, I hear you. And now that's changed and it doesn't work. However, the flip of the coin is, are the dwellings that are going to get built from here on out a better quality? I'm optimistic and I think they would be a better outcome. So I go, well, that's a step in a right direction. However, short-term pain.
Short-term pain is they're not getting built.
Yeah. And then this is the other thing that no one really says is planning regulations and policies, they don't time in with the current economic climate. They just don't work that way. So it's unfortunate that it's timed in when we've had a housing shortage.
The biggest housing shortage ever.
And it's got harder to deliver housing, but I don't think that's been done on purpose by any means.
No, but I think that's nearly the problem, is it's been done irrespective of it. And that in the one time where most critically in our lifetime we've needed all hands on deck to make it as easy as possible to put a roof over people's heads, there's a policy that's been implemented that's specifically and intentionally made it harder to provide a subset of housing that, especially in the absence of apartment buildings coming up in any measure, would have been very helpful, especially at the lower end of the price point, that people don't complain about and they're happy enough living in. People in the aristocracy have decided, no, you need better housing than this. We're going to make sure that the minimum standard is increased for certain situations, whereas most parts around the world would never complain at all when it comes to the provision of a brand new 3x2 in Hammersley or Greenwood or Coolbellup or Willagee as to which side of the street it was built on in the first place.
Correct.
No house is perfect, and you can never actually get many houses that perfect, even the most expensive ones.
Yeah, and it is hard because most people would probably say when they buy a house, you go through a home open once, you spend 5-10 minutes in the house. You probably can't appreciate all the design considerations, but then does that amount to a dollar value? Maybe not. So that commercial aspect is always hard to rationalise in a planning context. But then you also need to look, I guess, and go out, not just infill, some of the bigger subdivisions, the ramifications and effects that had on larger estates where they've got structure plans and they've had years of planning in place. and now they've effectively got a redesign. So it would have been quite difficult and frustrating for some larger players.
Yeah, jarring. And they're the ones that were protected at the end of the day when deferrals came in and exemptions came in. It was the small scale stuff that actually, I think, was the collateral damage. And we're seeing it now. We just don't have the applications coming in WAPC for survey strata subdivision anywhere near what it used to be in a time when the small scale guys should be the most incentivized of all people because they're solving the most critical problem, in my belief.
Yeah, and that's probably, if there's a tip to anyone listening that's looking at maybe buying land and building, is if it's zoned R30 and above and it's an MD coding, it's in a group dwelling of some kind, make sure you check that you can build what you think you can build, because there's nothing worse than having or seeing someone settle on a piece of land and then come to you for advice and realise that what they plan to do, they can't really do.
Yeah, they did it next door. Why can't I do it?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, mate, it's changed.
Yeah, there's some really tough conversations to have. So I think due diligence on land that's infill is probably more important than ever.
Let's talk about the good things that have come out of the medium density code throughout 2024. What applications are you seeing come through that wouldn't have been able to be approved a year ago, where you go, these are great, and we're building them and it's happening?
So I've got a couple examples. The first thing would be just creativity. I think the planners at councils actually enjoy seeing creative applications. It's not just the same thing over and over. So I think that's quite refreshing for the people assessing them. We've had the introduction of small dwellings or universal dwellings. I think they're quite a good little outcome.
Explain those in the most practical lay way for a listener who wouldn't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so effectively it's you get a concession on the yield you can apply, so a 35% reduction, and the building footprint basically ranges from around 70 square metres to 115 square metres, depending on which class you fall into, which ultimately lets you create a 2x2, 3x1, something along those lines. And I just think it's going to create a really affordable housing product, which they'll start to trickle out in the next 6 to 12 months. We'll see a few come to market, and that's going to be really good. That's something we haven't had.
Give us some examples of locations and the product.
Yeah, so
foreshadow a realestate.com ad.
Yeah, look, I think City of Stirling's prime for this. City of Vincent, those areas. So your Scarboroughs, your Double Views. So one great example. There's a lot of half blocks, the old cottage homes that are maybe subdivided once with a block out the back, but there are 40 on, say, 400 square metres. Traditionally, that's not a subdivisible block, but now that's a duplex site where you can have two small dwellings.
Like side by side,
street facing,
9 metre wide.
Yeah,
yep.
That's a really cool, funky, quirky outcome, and I think it actually fits the areas where you want to have that kind of housing. And then I guess the flow on from that as well, if you look at the changes with granny flats in Western Australia, you can have an auxiliary dwelling basically on any property now. There's no minimum lot size, so you can effectively put that in with the small dwelling if it's designed correctly. So you can kind of have that dual key aspect, which is pretty cool and something we haven't really seen in the market before.
Dual key is an interesting one. I remember maybe 7 years ago, clients who had put a building application in. There were 2 kitchens, there were 3 living areas, there was hallways that had doors for no reason, and you look at it and go, this is dual key. But it wasn't allowed to be approved at the time, and so they had to sort of tick every other box to make it just look like, oh, we're just for the teenage boy to sort of have his own space. But really, you knew that they were going to be having an external person coming in through the sliding door on the side and paying them rent under the table. Now you're actually able to do this, and to be frank, in the East Coast, you'd be able to do it for years.
It's good. I mean, if you look at it globally, it's common. LA, California, they've been doing it for decades. I think it's natural progression. The more the population grows, the more housing we need in the same place. So it's an easy way to get density without necessarily creating additional density.
Yeah.
So I think that was a fantastic thing that's come. It wasn't necessarily the medium density codes, but it was a change, and I think that's probably the best change that's happened.
Yeah, it is funny. That I think that also is going to have the most impact. It's all well and good to have a few of the other things we spoke about today. I think this is going to have the most impact on reducing cost of living for families who are happy to have a boarder staying in the house but not staying in the 4th bedroom, actually having their own nearly self-contained unit under the same roof, so it costs less to build in the first place. I'm seeing builds coming in where we're approving build designs on an infill land subdivision we're doing, where clearly that front master suite is actually an auxiliary dwelling.
One thing that probably doesn't get talked about enough is multi-generational living.
Yep.
I think there's going to be more people that maybe have children and want the grandparents over to babysit because the cost of childcare is so high.
Need them over to babysit.
Yeah, or maybe they travel, they want to lock everything in one room but still rent out the main house. As they get older, they can age in place and have live-in care. It's really, a house can play you out for a 20, 30-year life cycle if you get it right.
All right, last question, Dan. A little bit of an oracle question. 2025, we're about to head into it. It's crazy to think that we're nearly already in 2025. I'm excited about 2025. I think we're going to start seeing a little bit of progression in terms of some apartment buildings coming off. We're excited to see Alma Square in North Perth come through. There's a number of other applications that I'm hoping the big guys can justify getting off the ground from an infill perspective. Interest rates are going to start dropping next year, most likely. So what will that do to serviceability and then just fueling the continual price rises that, to be frank, are needed to justify apartment buildings in the first place? It's one big chicken and egg situation. That's what I'm thinking are the themes of what's probably going to happen. And then the race to amenity, the upsizing of people who have probably bought in areas they wouldn't have wanted to have bought if they could, and are now going to use the equity they've built over the last couple of years towards buying where they wanted to probably buy at a much higher price, but with equity now a few years later. From your perspective, when it comes to the developments you're doing, the clients you've got, what are you looking forward to seeing coming out of the ground that people will notice driving around the streets?
Yeah, there's some really cool projects about to get launched through the western suburbs. There's an array of apartments through Cottesloe. They're quite exciting. I think they're really cool. Towards the end of the year, it's always everyone gets a little bit tired, putted out, everyone's sort of exhausted. So I think the theme for next year is, I think, a little bit more optimism. I think we've got through a little bit of uncertainty with what's happening in the US and that election. Maybe we'll get some comfort that rates have peaked and dropped. So I think next year is really going to be an example of maybe seeing the hard work that's been put in over the last 3-4 years.
Capitalising.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. That's a really positive word to use, and a nice pun as well. Dan Paton from Developed, thanks so much for coming. You might have a great Christmas, and hopefully we'll chat to you in 2025.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Trent.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!